This is to guide you through intended learning outcome 1, which is considering research as a process. Consider what research do you need to do, and then we'll look at a generic process for producing an MSc research thesis. And finally we'll consider, are there particular types of research? What is research? What's good research? Research equals importance multiplied by novelty. These are the two components that are essential for research. There is a third component, which is rigour. So we have importance, novelty, and rigour. Importance multiplied by novelty multiplied by rigour. However, rigour, if that were to mean using the best available methods, e.g. the particular best instruments or the best techniques, then rigour actually is a subset of novelty. So you could see we've actually got importance, novelty, and a subset of novelty, which is rigour. Also, if rigour can be regarded as a prerequisite of published science, so for science to be published, it's been peer reviewed, and if that's the case, then the degree of rigour in carrying out the science really is accepted, and so rigour is either a 1 or a 0 in our equation for what is research. So if there is no rigour, then it's not research, and if there is rigour, it counts as a value of 1, because if it's been published, then the rigour is sufficient for it to be published. So rigour is particularly then only important in reviewing work prior to publication. So if you're trying to decide if research should be published, then we do need to check that it's been carried out rigorously. Or, prior to carrying out a piece of work, you need to demonstrate that the work will be done rigorously. Rigour is also much more easy to grade. It can be graded, and it doesn't really require any value judgments to decide whether the work has been done rigorously. That's not the case necessarily for how important a piece of work is or how novel the work is. If we consider then, for us to assess whether research is good research, we have to consider how important and how novel. If we consider importance, a problem might be a generic problem, which would be something that was a worldwide problem, or it might be a specific problem, which is just a problem in a particular town. The novelty might be something that's never been done before, anywhere in the world, or it might be something that's never been done before in this town. So the novelty and importance can actually be classified into specific and generic. Also from this, you might recognise that importance and novelty, though we're treating them as independent entities, are not wholly independent. So research then equals importance multiplied by novelty, and the importance is greater when it's generic, and the novelty is greater when it's generic. So ideally research should be important in a generic way and novel in a generic way. It doesn't mean that research that of specific importance or specific novelty is not done or is not good, but we'll return to that later. There's a drive to assess the quality of research because it's one of the primary outputs of universities, which is what we've discussed previously, and therefore it relates to how well funded universities are. So as a primary output, research must be rated in order to decide how much money to give to the universities. So there's a UK research excellence framework that university researchers have to submit their work to every 5 years, and then it's judged to be between 1 and 4 stars. So there is a scheme, there's a marking scheme for our research. going from 1 star, which is quality that's recognised nationally in terms of originality, significance and rigour, all the way to 4 star, which is quality that's world leading in terms of originality, significance and rigour. World leading 4-star research is also recognised to be potentially game changing or agenda setting, whereas 1-star research probably has local value and local impact. A reasonable question for you would be, what proportion of research do you think is agenda setting? The University of Manchester aims to have 10% of research as agenda setting. Does that seem possible? Or do you think there may be something called grade inflation going on? So we can plot the position of our research on axes of importance and novelty. And the axes run from specific to generic. So up in the top right hand corner we've got 4-star research, generic importance and generic novelty. Assessing the importance of a research requires the greatest value judgment, whereas novelty is perhaps more clearly provable, and rigour, which you described previously, is the one that requires least value judgment. If we consider importance, well, importance may change over time. So what was blue sky research may eventually become applied, such as quantum theory and perhaps graphene, which is something that Manchester's very keen on. So this blue sky research, which may not have seemed important, may become very important. Similarly, what was inductive speculation may, after much deductive work, become foundational and therefore very, very important. And examples of this are relativity and continental drift. We're going to return to the terms inductive and deductive later. Novelty is more clearly provable. However, research may be overdriven by novelty. So academics may spend a lot of time just trying to find something novel to do, because that's one of the parameters in deciding if it's good research. And often, if investment's been made in some sort of novel piece of equipment, some novel technique, some novel instrument, some novel hammer, then that actually drives the work that goes on. And all work using the hammer becomes research. There's a counter-argument to this, which is the positive outcomes that come from blue sky research. So it may be, or it may appear, that the work has been driven by the fact that there's a particular piece of equipment that's only available in perhaps Manchester University. However, the research that's done may not be useful immediately. It may be blue sky research, but it's possible that becomes very important later on. Ideally, the research itself should be self-assessing. The assessment's really in the hands of the author of the work. This is a good thing if the author is a seeker of truth. The standard format for reporting research allows importance and novelty to be made explicit. That's part of the job of the author, is to communicate the importance and novelty, and therefore, if that's done correctly, the research is effectively self-assessing. However, reliance on this being in the hands of the author can be a bad thing if the author is the seeker of money. And again, I point out that scientific papers are effectively currency when it comes to university funding and funding of academics. Similarly, if the author is a seeker of money or the seeker of a master's degree. So when research outputs are monetised, academics learn to game the system. All authors say in their introduction to their piece of work, this work is very important. So it's really up to the reader to consider importance and novelty. It's worth considering whether important problems all require research. Research requires importance, but do all important problems require research? Academics and scientists can lose sight of this. Research may not be necessary to solve important problems. It's well known that solutions exist for many pollution remediation challenges, but places remain polluted. So it might be argued that it's not really necessary to do more research. There is a counter-argument to this, which would be to say that research is required, but not into pollution remediation, but into socio-economic and behavioural psychology research, which might be more instructive as to why the solutions to pollution remediation have not been implemented. So after considering what is research and what makes good research, what research do you need to do? To further understand what is good research, the main external resource you'll use is explorable.com. This information is all on Blackboard and you should read through it. You should look through explorable.com. We've identified on Blackboard which particular pages you should look at. There's also a few books listed there. Thomas Kuhn and the Structure of Scientific Revolutions is a book that you should pretend that you've read. It's a thin book, so you could actually read it, but that's the book that everybody quotes. There's another thin book, which is by John Gray, who's a political philosopher, called Straw Dogs, which you could read as well, as it's a thin book. You may find it slightly depressing, as he breaks down the links between research and progress, but it's a very interesting read. And then John Waller, Fabulous Science, is particularly entertaining, and I strongly recommend it as a book that you can read and enjoy as general reading. He shines a light on some very well-known science and explains the original science that was carried out and whether that's really how the science has been understood subsequently. So he talks about the Darwinian revolution and explains the lack of connection between the Darwinian revolution and much of Darwin's actual work. In a similar vein, there's a book by John Grant called Corrupted Science, and if you don't feel like reading, then at least you can listen to a podcast. If you click on the link, there's a 20-minute podcast. It's part of a series of several. I think if you listen to this one, it's the final summary one, then you'll find it hard to resist listening to the others as well. So we can consider then, what research do you need to do? I think from the foregoing argument, you could recognise that classifying research as good research and bad research is really an artefact, perhaps of the university research excellence framework exercise. And really, the aim should be to carry out appropriate research rather than good or bad. Appropriate research for an MSc thesis just requires you to understand and explain the type of research you're doing, but it's immaterial whether that's specific or generic, or inductive or deductive. And for an explanation of inductive or deductive, you need to refer to explorable.com. After you've read about induction and deduction, you should be able to answer the practice questions. Given that it's immaterial whether the research is specific or generic, or inductive or deductive, then we can start to see how we can teach research as a process rather than concentrating on the content. We have our graph of research, and the MSc project can fit in any of those quadrants: the degree of novelty, the degree of importance. The importance and novelty are not critical. What is critical is the explicit communication of the importance and novelty, and the full recognition of the importance and novelty. And then in red, because it's so important, is the demonstration of the rigour. It's critical because that's part of the process. For there to be a generic process for an MSc research thesis, it needs to be something that can be taught, and therefore something that can be assessed. And therefore appropriate means it meets the marking criteria. This is reiterated on the Blackboard page, so do read through this information. and the items that relate to the generic process of research are also downloadable. There's a thesis marking scheme which you can download, and a guidance to writing your introduction and project proposal. These things will actually take place in semester 2 when you're working with a project supervisor, but it's worth having a look through it now. We can make a comparison of research that's done for publication and your MSc research project. It's possible these two could overlap, but it's not necessarily the case. So importance, research publication, is it important, is a question that be asked. Your research project, is it as important as you say it is? And that means as important and novel as possible, given the time and money available for the project. With novelty, for publication, straightforward, is it novel? MSc research project, is it as novel as you say it is? Rigour, are the findings true? Also for your research project, are the findings true? That's where research for publication and your MSc research project are identical. Their degree of rigour is identical for both. And with regard to the outcomes, in research for publication, it will be judged on have the questions you set as being important and novel been answered, and actually are the findings positive? For publication, find it very difficult to publish negative findings, which many people recognise as a failing of the research publication process, because negative findings are clearly very important, but it's hard to get them published. For your MSc research project, the question is, was it reasonable to try to answer the questions set as being important and novel? It's not important whether you do answer them, but if it wasn't reasonable to try to do so, then that would be a problem. The final thing is to consider whether there are types of research. This attempt to classify research into types is useful in that it helps you to learn the generic process of carrying out research. So you can try and recognise and classify research into types and try and assess the quality of the research in order to help you to learn a generic process of carrying out research. And in order to do that, you're going to be having tutorials over the first 8 weeks of the semester, in which you're going to be in small group seminars which will introduce you to the wide range of research carried by staff in this department. The subjects of the research will be very different between the 8 seminars, but one of your tasks will be to recognise the generic process of research that's been carried out, and also to make a judgment on the quality of the research that's been presented to you. And again, on the Blackboard page, there's some more information about types of research, and some of the types of research are described, and you can see whether the research that's presented to you fits with these types. And also, these are the types of research that many MSc projects carry out. And in the rest of this unit, Measuring and Predicting, we'll be looking at some case studies that fall within these different types of research. And they move from something that's as simple as making a measurement to developing a more complicated model. Having listened to this and read through the material on Blackboard, you should be able to answer the practice questions.